welcome to another podcast of Family Troubles. Today, I'm very excited to meet with Valerie Galkinskaya. Valerie is the managing director and head of the Merrill Center of Family Wealth. She and her team work with hundreds of individuals and families to navigate some of life's most important financial decisions. Valerie's experience spans family wealth and strategy. She speaks nationally on family wealth, governance, and multi-generational decision making, and her insights have been featured in Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Barron's, and many other publications. For those of you who follow my work, questions about inheritance, estate planning, financial support become especially complicated in the context of family conflict and estrangement. So decisions about wills, trust, beneficiaries, and gifts are rarely, almost never, purely financial. I'm sure Valerie would say that there's no such thing as a purely financial decision. They're deeply emotional and often tied to hope, loss, fairness, and legacy. So welcome, Valerie. Such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Josh. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so you've worked with hundreds of wealthy families. What do you think the biggest misconception that people have about inherited wealth and family happiness?
It's a great question. I think one of the biggest misconceptions that people have is that inherited wealth on its own can enhance, can destroy family relationships.
Hmm.
In my experience, and as you said, I feel incredibly gratified. My team and I work with over 370 ultra high net worth families over the years. So,
Wow, a lot.
they are really vulnerable and they're obviously letting us into really personal and uncertain
Yeah.
questions in their mind. I would say what I've found, Josh, over the years is that wealth is really an amplifier, right?
Hmm.
It's not a substitute for trust, relationships, shared purpose. And what I mean
Hmm.
by that is if you have uncertain expectations, if you have maybe some fragility in trust, wealth is going to amplify that. But
Yeah,
wealth on its own, it's a tool, not a value. So
right.
it really is about more about the application of that.
That makes sense. Yeah. Well, in our society, I think there's so much because we're one of the things in our culture is that we're, a melting pot of different cultures and identities. And, the advantage to that is that we can kind of have the shared goal of being successful in the US, but it also means we don't really have a shared cultural identity beyond kind of the acquisition of success in a certain way, wealth. And I sometimes wonder if people are kind of misled by that with the idea that, oh, well, once I become wealthy, or if I can pass that wealth on to my kids, then they're going to be happy. But that's really not the case, is it?
It's not. And, you also bring up, I think, an important point and something I've been very humble to learn, which is, I was joking with a colleague the other day, but it's true. I meet with families, every day. And
Yeah,
I feel like probably average, 5 to 6 times a day, I ask somebody, what is the purpose of your wealth?
yeah.
And I bring that up because it is infinitely easier for me to ask that question than for someone to answer it. And I think to your point about happiness, the reality is most people have not had the time to really think through that deeply, right? I mean, most people would
Yeah,
say to be a good person, to love my family, all wonderful things. So
right.
now to be the cynical New Yorker here, but they're not helpful. If I had a meeting last week, if somebody's question is, how do I think about gifting to my 3 adult children? Right?
Hmm.
They're much more general. So that is why in our team, I see really our mission and our work is really kind of answering a different question, if you will, of saying, how can we help individuals and families define what success means to them, whatever it is? And
Hmm.
and how do we help them, empower them to make effective decisions, both individually and collectively, whatever the family structure happens to
Yeah.
be.
Well, it seems like so many parents avoid talking to their adult children about money and inheritance and the like. Do you find that that's true in your line of work? And if so, what do you think's going on in the minds of these parents?
I do find that there's definitely some anxiety around it, not,
Uh-huh.
every single individual, but generally, Josh, I found it's interesting, regardless sometimes of the source of wealth or the background, there tend to be two really driving fears, just
Mhm.
to be candid,
Yeah.
that stop parents or the grandparent or aunt, uncle from disclosing or sharing. So
Yeah.
one is this fear of the wealth impeding a motivation,
Hmm.
right?
Sure.
Sometimes people will be more kind of open with me and kind of, sometimes they will kind of hide that message. But, the biggest thing I would say, and I was meeting with a family a couple of weeks ago, brought this up, and they have relatively young children. But, the wife, I tried to normalize for her, and she kind of really opened up, and she really said, look, Valerie, I did not grow up in an environment where I felt like I could pursue my passion. I felt like I had
Mm,
to find a job that, earned a certain amount because I had to support myself. My
right,
children are going to be in a different circumstance. What I don't want is and she has two daughters, to feel like they can just kick back and relax.
right. Yeah.
So it's really that fear. And interestingly enough, it's timely that we're speaking today. We, on the team, publish proprietary research. Kind of, we survey
Oh, cool.
ultra high net worth clients. And I just had a call this morning looking at the findings from our latest. So this is kind of preview
Oh,
for
cool.
your listeners. But in the latest, just because it's relevant to your question, we surveyed about 290 ultra high net worth clients.
Mm-hmm.
And we asked them, how confident are you with your children, those of you who have children, kind of stewarding this money this well?
Yeah, right.
9%, 9% said that they felt that their children were very prepared to handle wealth. 44% said not at all. Okay.
Interesting.
Ultra high net worth clients, by the way, what I found most interesting, spans ages. So we're talking from millennials to baby boomers. So
Interesting.
this isn't just people, with younger kids or older
Right,
kids. And I think that finding really highlights what I tend to see anecdotally in my work, which is you have that fear. Now, if that fear is warranted, it's a separate topic, but that's, I would say,
right.
fear one.
Uh-huh.
The second fear that I think is a little bit more nuanced, that I would love to normalize, is a lot of people, I think, avoid or delay speaking about wealth or kind of their planning because they themselves have not taken the time to really define it. Is it comprehensive? Does it achieve my goals? And again, to that point, in the same survey, 90%, we asked people, how many of you have a trust and estate plan?
Uh-huh.
This is ultra high net worth. 90% said yes. Not
Uh-huh.
surprising. No aha there.
Right.
Then we said, how many of you could clearly summarize the plan? 4%, Josh, said, I feel very confident I could clearly summarize. 24% said, I'm confident. So
Wow.
28%, right? The balance have, in many ways, no
Wow.
idea. And I don't want to be judgmental. The reality is most people across, wealth levels, I
Right.
think, feel good and feel like, okay, I have a will, I have maybe a healthcare proxy, I kind of
Yeah.
did it, I checked the box, I'm done. How
Yeah.
often are people really revisiting that? And I find that that second one is also one of the deterrents.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, and in some ways, the parents' caution is kind of well deserved, isn't it? Because doesn't the research show that in general, people who have a lot of wealth and pass it on, that in general, that wealth doesn't really persist, or that in general, and I could be wrong about this because I haven't really studied it a lot, but it's with a little bit I'm familiar with that research is that wealth doesn't necessarily persist across from the inheriting generations, that a lot of it gets sort of waste or not sufficiently developed or preserved. Is that an accurate remembering on
It's
that?
accurate, and there are different research studies and different kind of use it. But yes,
Mm-hmm.
general strokes, you're absolutely right. To me, what's most interesting about that research that doesn't get highlighted is
Yeah.
if you ask why.
Oh,
And I've asked that question. We run a financial education program called the Financial Boot Camp, and as part of my session, we've been running it. This is our 20th year. So I've had the good
wow.
fortune to ask that question
That's
many,
great.
many, many times.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is when I ask the participants, rising gen, older, why, a lot of people will say very good answers, by the way. I don't know, for investment trajectory, divorce, right?
Right.
Uncertain external factors. Fair.
Yeah.
If you actually look at what causes that, and I think the research maybe that you're referencing, the large majority was due to lack of or limited communication in the family
Mm-hmm.
and unprepared heirs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I absolutely agree with you that, yes, it can be a challenging forecast, or kind of the probabilities can be challenging. But what I often emphasize to the families that I work with is if those two are the two driving factors, you have the capacity to work on your ability to control that, right?
Right.
You
Right.
can effectively communicate, you can prepare the next generation. So those
Yeah.
things, it's not a foregone conclusion.
Well, do you think parents feel sort of guilty about being that kind of authoritative about their money, sort of like they're going to be accused of being too controlling or intrusive or that sort of thing? If we say, okay, so you've got this money, but you can't get it until you're 30 and it has to be allocated in this sort of way, and your children aren't going to inherit it until this point in time. Do parents worry about that kind of thing?
They do. And it's interesting. I had a meeting earlier this month with kind of that setup where husband and wife, first generation wealth creators, they have four young adult children. Kind of the youngest, pardon me, is just graduating college. So it's kind of that
Mhm.
inflection point. And they've delayed it because their premise has been, which, I can't argue with, our children are still developing. We have to see
Right.
how they perform. So that's absolutely their prerogative. The thing that I always highlight to families, there's a distinction I would draw between I don't want you to have control now
Hmm.
and I want to talk about this later
Hmm.
versus I'm going to be so nebulous with you
Yeah.
that you're not going to be able to plan your own life.
Oh,
And
it's a good point.
I just had this with another family. Son, kind of eldest son in the family, is married. And there's been some disclosure, kind of some of the assets. And what he said to me directly, privately, is he said, what I'm really struggling with is, first off, I love my parents. Forget about money, forget about resources. They've always been wonderful parents. I had a great childhood. My father, in particular, he said to me, is this very generous man, and he loves to talk in generalities. He hates specifics. He is he's kind of a big picture kind of vision
Right.
person. And he said, I'll give you a concrete example. My father has always said, education, now that we've earned this wealth, education, don't worry. College, graduate school, your children, don't worry about it. And he
Right.
said, my wife and I are preparing to have our first child. And every time I ask him, so dad, I'm so grateful. So are you going to pay for college for the grandkids? And, he says, yeah, that's the plan, but I don't want you to count on it. You know what I mean?
Right.
Things can change.
Great.
And that's very true. Investment portfolios could shift. So many things can change.
Right.
But the son, I think, also makes a valid point, which is if it's so nebulous that to some extent it impacts the rising generation's ability to make their own plans,
Yeah.
that can have obviously negative implications.
Well, not only for them individually, but potentially for the relationship, right? That sort of predictability is key to our sense of security and low anxiety. And it seems like it could be very disruptive, both for the relationship and that individual who can't really plan on it. And
Absolutely. And that is why on disclosure, to the extent it's helpful for anyone listening, what we found within our team, the Center for Family Wealth, is that a lot of not just wealth creators, rising gen, all of us, a lot of people view disclosure as a light switch. You're either on or you're off.
right. Yeah.
And that's why it creates this pressure of I have to have all of this information. I have to be completely prepared. We view it as much more of a dimmer switch. And I think
Hmm.
if somebody can reorient their perspective to see it as a dimmer switch, which is a lot of the work that I do with families. And when I say dimmer switch, you're starting with purpose. This is what it means for us. Wealth, for example, is providing for education, is
Right.
um, you know, giving you some opportunities to pursue things you're interested, but still have skin in the game. What
Hmm.
is it? So that's the purpose. Then the structures, these are the buckets, or we call them wallets.
Hmm.
And then lastly, sharing the dollars. So you don't have to have this, pressure to share the dollars, but you're also not misleading, which Josh, I know is important to your work, of
Right.
saying there's only this bucket. I had this happen years ago of there's just this one bucket of assets. And when I
Hmm.
met with the parents, I said respectfully, you're coming to me for my advice.
Right.
And my advice is that pretending like buckets 2 through 4, which hold, by the way, 85% of your incredibly significant wealth,
Right.
is not going to really do you any favors when your children will naturally learn about that over time.
Hmm.
And
That's
they
interesting.
ultimately came over to my suggested approach.
That's interesting. Yeah. Can you say more about that? About sort of the advantage of having it more kind of allocated in terms of these wallets and the disadvantage of having it just be sort of one big fund or something.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the biggest, challenges that we see both from the wealth creator kind of regardless of generation, I will add, or the rising generation is this idea that wealth, one of the rising generation family members I've been working with for her family probably about 7 or 8 years now. She said to me kind of early on, she said, look, Valerie, I am grateful, right? Like I want to first caveat all of this. She said, one of the things I'm struggling with is when my parents, even my aunt, uncle, because my siblings, when we talk about wealth, it feels like a black box. It is
Hmm.
wealth. It has this quote. And she said, I
Right.
really don't understand what it means. And even in her case, she said, my mother referenced a particular education account or annual exclusion gifts that someone, may be familiar with, which
Yeah.
means any of us can give a certain amount free of gift tax every year. She said, I, I'm grateful. She was talking to me about one thing, but I don't understand the context which it lives.
Hmm.
Often ends up happening is you have this rising gen family member who kind of feeling it's still nebulous, and then as in her case, then you had the mom who was feeling a little bit when she came to me. We work so hard, and my daughter doesn't seem like she's really grateful or appreciative of it. Whereas she is appreciative, but she's really struggling to understand. And that's why I often say the opposite of uncertainty is not disclosure, it's
Hmm.
understanding. And there's a difference
Hmm.
between disclosure and understanding. So when we talk about the wallets and we have a white paper and it's available for anyone who's interested externally,
Yeah.
it's really this idea of saying you have this comprehensive estate plan, or let's say you don't have an estate plan, you're just getting started. That's okay
Yeah.
too.
Right.
Is there what we essentially created, Josh, is a template, one piece of paper, one slide that says, hey, rising generation family member, there are, let's say, 5 wallets. Wallet one, things that you earn and you could invest. Wallet two, anything that is a direct gift to you. So, for example, a holiday gift, someone paying directly for education would fall in there.
Hmm.
Wallet three, anything gifted in trust,
Hmm.
right? Wallet four, anything that the parent or parents have, which obviously is not theirs, but just to kind of acknowledge assets, some of which, likely will pass on. And then wallet five, which I think is important, are any philanthropic assets. We work with a lot of families who have donor advised funds, family foundations. And there's a
Hmm.
whole, right, all of the things we've talked about so far are also relevant to foundations of feeling like, do I have a voice here? Do I have a vote? Kind of what's
Right.
happening here.
Yeah. That's interesting. Well, yeah, well, let's talk about entitlement because I hear that a lot from the parents in my practice, who are mostly Boomers and maybe Gen X, saying that their children feel entitled to something that they don't feel like, they've necessarily earned. And particularly if there's a lot of conflict. I mean, it's one thing if it's a really close parent-adult-child relationship but for a parent whose children are, maybe disdainful or critical or even estranged, it's harder for the parent to feel as generous or or even is willing to kind of be as disclosing about the assets than they might be otherwise. And do you come across that kind of thing as much? And if so, do you have particular counsel around it?
I do in the sense, I think to the latter point of what you say, something I mention a good amount is I call it deciding how to decide.
Uh-huh.
And what I mean by that is I find that generally clients spend a lot of time, rightfully so, thinking about investment strategy, wealth structure, and kind of the hard kind of asset, diversification, location, all those things are great.
Right.
When they share it, even with the adult children, sometimes it's kind of like this exists. But the notion of not just what is there, but how are you making decisions about it is nebulous. So I'll
Hmm.
give you an example with a real life family. This had to do with philanthropy, but I think it still applies. This is a family that I met about 5 years ago. They were actually the inspiration behind a paper we wrote on philanthropy.
Mm.
So just to kind of summarize, husband and wife, first generation wealth creators. Source of the wealth was that the husband was a Fortune 100 CEO.
Mm.
He retired. The family had always been philanthropic. Sincerely, the kids, were donating things. They were working kind of soup kitchens, volunteering, all of that. So he had retired, had all this free time, and invited his children, his 4 children, to this meeting. This is before we engaged. This was
Hmm.
the impetus. And he said, "This is going to be great." We invited them. Okay, it's a 2-hour meeting to talk about giving away $1 million. The reason I met this family is because their advisor, who's a very close friend of theirs and who I work with a lot, called me and said, I have this lovely family and they are just feel like they're in crisis. The wife slash mom called me in tears and said, I feel like I failed. Forget about money. I feel like I failed as a mother. And
Mm.
he said to me, will you speak with them? So I said, of course. So I spoke first with the parents to try to understand just what happened. So what happened is they had this meeting. There was zero context to the children. They knew their dad, obviously, kind of was a CEO. Everything was publicly available. And because of that, they knew how much their father earned.
Yeah. Right.
They, as many people today, again, in various networks, can Google, can Zillow, can, all those things.
Yep.
So they brought them into the room. They had never done the wallets or the buckets I described. So these are adult children. They took time off work. One of them was in graduate school. And essentially the reason the mom was so upset, you had one child, the brother, who started basically kind of, whining about why are we here giving away $1 million to strangers? I want to move to my wife and I want to move to a bigger house and the mortgage. The mom, to your question, is sitting there saying, what, I quote from her, what a brat. You have his sibling, one daughter who felt um, really just uncomfortable with the idea of the scale of the wealth and kind of
Uh-huh.
basically sitting there saying, I think we should give away an even larger amount. And you have
Oh,
the dad
interesting.
saying, if I put it all in her hands, she's going to give it away to the penguins, Valerie. And, I smiled and he said, no, that's not a metaphor. She's actually going to give it
She
away to the
actually said
penguins.
I'm going to penguins. Yeah.
Two,
Oh dear.
then
Yeah.
you had another child, another daughter who had volunteered with a particularly kind of more of a politically charged organization. And the parents said, that's not, we're not relevant. And she said, are you kidding? I donated, I volunteered. And then you have the fourth one who's basically like, money makes me feel uncomfortable. So I'm here out of respect. So
Wow.
as you can imagine, I mean, especially given your expertise, Josh, like this is
Yeah.
just set up for failure.
Oh yeah.
And the reason I bring this up is not in any way to minimize their challenge. They're a lovely family. And I think the good
Yeah.
news, the reason I'm sharing that story is because once I met with them and we worked with them, we were able to help them, provide some context on the overall wealth. Where does this fit in? Not to say that the brother was able, got additional gifting right away, but how does it fit in to make it clear to him it's not like they're giving away all the wealth. One, this is
Hmm.
a particular bucket,
Right.
but also to the deciding how to decide point to make it clear. The biggest challenge, if I could tie up across all of these nuances, was
Yeah.
that the kids were there thinking, I have a vote. The
Right.
parents were there saying, you have a voice. And when I asked them very directly at the very beginning, I remember this conversation vividly once they kind of calmed. I said, can I ask you just an honest question? There's no right or wrong. I'm just curious. What was your motivate, right? Like, why were they there? What did you really hope to accomplish? And they said, well, we wanted their input. I mean, it's our decision. It's our family foundation.
Right.
But we love them. They're smart. It's their input. So that, Josh, is a lot of what I see, whether it's a family foundation, investment portfolio, you can put anything kind of in the example.
Yeah.
But it's that idea of you have individuals who love each other, who are family, but who are coming to the table expecting very different things.
Right.
Unless you clarify the process you're going to use, the rules of the road, of course you're going to be resentful. Of course you're going to be upset. And it's once I think they understood that each of them was able to really take a deep breath and say, what are we trying to achieve here? And what
Hmm.
are our different roles?
Interesting. Well, I like the concept of you have a vote, you have a voice, but not a vote. Is that what you tell the parents to tell the children, or is that sort of the framework that you give to the parents that they have a voice? Because it seems like a useful framework because I think it goes back to your earlier point about lack of clarity leads to more anxiety, and more anxiety leads to more conflict and potentially things falling apart. So it seems like parents have to be comfortable establishing a certain kind of authority, don't they?
They do. And I think the other thing, just to extend it, that I've, humbly learned is you can have one family and you can have, let's say, four different topics. So philanthropy could be one, investing, but again, investing in a silo, like investing over what? Investing their own earning, right? You have full
Right.
latitude. If you pick three or four topics, on one of the topics, the adult child may have a voice, not a vote.
Hmm.
But you can have, I have another family that has a kind of a real estate LLC, and there are very clearly, right, like legally written in votes and how things
Yeah.
work. So it really
Right.
depends. And I think also the reason I bring that up is it doesn't have to be, again, this, a lot of our work, a lot of my work, I feel like is moving individuals from this binary thinking. It doesn't have to be on or off. It doesn't have to be just a voice or a vote forever
Hmm.
for everything. It's
Yeah.
really understanding what are you trying to achieve and what is the context of what you're talking about. Because
Hmm.
unless you can identify that, you are bound. And this is why I bring up this family. They're so loving, they're so communicative. And I'm so proud of the fact and really so gratified that I was able to play a small part in helping them, get on the right track. But the reality is they have a very successful family foundation. But beyond that, why do I say successful? They meet annually. They have quarterly meetings, right? They do this because they want to, not
Yeah.
because they're dragging their feet. And it took time. So I also want to normalize that for everyone. This does not happen, you don't kind of, you know, click your heels
Right.
together. Like it takes time and effort.
Right. Well, and they also sound like they were all kind of healthy enough and mature enough to engage at that level. But what happens when you have, it only takes like one mentally ill person, be it parent or adult child or in-law, son-in-law or daughter-in-law to kind of screw up the whole thing. And how I'm sure you have to have seen that kind of thing. I don't know how often, but I see it every single day with my clients. Do you have a sort of a structure or advice in mind for those kinds of parents or situations?
And that's a great question, Josh. I think for those sort of situations, you get into this fair versus equal versus equitable
Yeah.
idea. And the reason I say that is I always joke if I had a dollar every time someone came to me and said, should it be fair or should it be equal, like in respect to this?
Right.
The reality is it depends, which I know is a very, kind of easy to answer but not helpful
It's okay.
answer.
It's
But
my
the
world too.
reason the reason I say it depends is let's take fairness for a second. There is no fairness. And what I mean by that is there's only perception of fairness.
Fair enough.
You have your view of fairness, I have mine. So to go back to your question, I'll give you a direct example because another family. Let's say there are three adult children in a family, which was the case here, and one child is navigating some mental health issues, right?
Hmm.
So one child, all three kids graduated from college and top colleges at that, but
Yeah.
that child is just having a tough time, right? He's not able to hold on to a job. And then you have these two superstar siblings, like
Yep.
superstar siblings,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So the parents, the reason I started working with them, they had a really basic and I think very fair question, which is we want to be thoughtful. They definitely bought into the idea of what I was saying in the beginning of a magnifier, right? We don't want to give this child kind of wealth where maybe they're doing kind of unhealthy things or kind of dangerous things.
Sure. Yeah.
And not but we have these two other kids. What was interesting is how many of our money stories growing up we bring into our decisions, not the kids, but the adults, kind of
Mm,
the parents. And what was
mm,
interesting about this family, the reason I thought of them is the dad in this family said, look, I grew up in a lower middle class family. I did not have access to any of this wealth.
right.
That said, I was always the type A kid. He's the older brother. He said, my brother always struggled. I love him, but he always struggled. And he said, my parents always spent more time, energy, money on him. So my
Yeah.
whole life, the message was that we'll call him John, not his actual name. John needed more, right? You have to understand. And he said,
I actually learned recently,
yeah,
sorry to interrupt you, but it's so interesting. I actually recently learned there's a term for that child called the glass child because they're doing so well that they're sort of seen through and they end up feeling
that's
kind of
interesting. Yeah.
neglected because they're so successful. So anyway, sorry to interrupt you, but
No,
go
no,
ahead.
no. That's interesting. I'm going
I
to write
just
that
think it's
down. And
such a,
that totally makes sense. And it's very
right.
consistent, by the way, Josh, with what he said, which is, the parents, I think, right, it's very easy to judge. And I think one of the things I've learned professionally, I think personally, is, uh, parents are just adults kind of doing their best. And I think
Absolutely. Yeah.
it really takes some maturity to acknowledge that. But it's very interesting what you said. And I wrote that down. His comments were very consistent with how you described Glass Child a moment ago, because he said it was very much, you're doing well, you don't
Right.
need it. And the
Right.
reason I bring it up, he said, now I have wealth more than, I ever dreamed of. And I have these three children. And he said, I am fearful. I don't want to repeat a pattern. Whereas you have
Mhm.
his wife, who is an only child, who grew up in an upper middle class family, where she's like, I sincerely don't understand what your problem is. We have the resources. He needs help.
Yeah.
How obvious is this? So
Uh-huh.
it took some time working with them to figure out what sort of support, right? Do you give him direct money? Do you, which ultimately I suggest, and do you, pay for a career coach? Do you pay for some additional mental health, counseling? And
Right.
the most important, Josh, that I learned, whether it's fair versus equal versus equitable, however you define it, the most
Yeah.
important thing I've learned, cliff notes for that white paper, which also is available to anyone interested, is have you communicated the why? I
Mm,
really encouraged them, and they
it's
were
everything.
very defensive at first about this, and I would say kind of reluctant. And I said, "Look, it's your prerogative, right? This is your family, you know them best."
Yeah.
I said, and they said, our daughters will have no issue with that. I said, I know, but there's no harm in over communicating. So what I
No.
encouraged them to do was really, and this came at a kind of a fortuitous time because it was an inflection point. They had all graduated college. Some were kind of, one of their daughters, I think, had just gotten engaged. So they were doing more disclosure anyway. And I
Yeah.
really encourage them to say, I want you to highlight why you're doing it and how you're thinking about fairness versus equality generally. And they
Yeah.
were right. I mean, I have to give them credit. I met with the daughters. They did not. It's not like the daughters were saying everything's cheery. Oh, and then met with me and said, Valerie, I feel they didn't have.
Sure.
But one of the daughters, which kind of proves my point, when she was speaking with me, she said, I thought this was kind of superfluous. But Valerie, I would be lying if I didn't acknowledge that I haven't thought about what about 20 years from now, 30
Yeah.
years? How does this affect their planning, their gifting? Am I going to have to potentially, help take care of certain
Right.
things for my brother? And she wasn't
Yeah.
against that. She didn't see it necessarily as a burden, but she said,
Just hadn't thought it through.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's a great example. And I love your concept of you get a voice, but not a vote, because part of what you're saying is to really be effective, you have to give your kids a voice as parents, because you kind of have to know what their thoughts are. And maybe you'd even be persuaded to do something different once you've heard what their experience is. But if you just sort of deliver it and kind of lay it on them, these are the terms, they're non-negotiable. Kind of, I don't care what you think, or I care what you think, but I'm still not, they're still non-negotiable. That's a very different conversation than this is what we're considering, and this is the reasoning why we wanted to check in with you. Ultimately, it is our decision, but we did want to, see what you had to say or feel. That's a very different, much more respectful conversation.
100%. And what I would emphasize on what you just said a moment ago is this is our, I mean, you could say it
Right.
more softly,
Of
but
course.
just this
Yeah.
idea of we see this as consultative, right? And
Right.
the other thing I would mention, I don't know if you were going to ask about it, but kind of as an offshoot is, I brought up why I feel so privileged to do this. One of the reasons is the vulnerability that family members, in particular parents, oftentimes have to have. And what I would say to that is, to the consultative point, is there have been a few situations, and I could talk later if you're interested in a particular case, but where I've encouraged a parent, in this case, this was a divorced dad, blended family. He had a daughter from his first marriage, two from his second ex-wife, divorced wife.
Yeah.
Didn't have the closest relationship. And the reason he had delayed slash avoided talking about wealth is not because he didn't trust them, is because the source of his wealth is a privately held business and it's a very complicated situation. Long story short, he has very, very little liquidity and
Hmm.
very little visibility on when that liquidity will come.
Uh-huh.
And I encouraged him to highlight that to the kids, to really say, this is the reality of the situation. And exactly to your point, right now, I see it as consultative, meaning I'm going to make the decision, but I want to hear. And then over time, once I have more liquidity, we can talk about it. Can I tell you, Josh, it is one of those moments I always think about kind of when you get goosebumps. I'm sure you have some
Oh,
given
for
your
sure.
work.
Yep.
I went into this meeting. I remember a colleague of mine telling me, like, good luck, Val, because you had this first daughter from first marriage, much older than the other two kids, not a close relationship between the siblings.
Oh, it
But,
gets so messy. Yeah.
and he was like, you're doing a family meeting. But we, as we often do in our process, we did pre-meeting questionnaires. I spoke with each because I really want to just make sure that the agenda reflects, what everyone's thinking. And more to the point, I really encouraged him, and he was so nervous. And this is a very kind of hard charging CEO sort of person, but you could tell it was kind of, very nerve wracking. And I really
Yeah.
encouraged him to use his words because he kept saying, well, you'll explain it better. And I said, no, but it's not, these are not my children. I
Right.
want you to start. And he had these bullets, and I said, don't memorize, just write it. And he really spoke from the heart and said, look, I love you all. I know I haven't shared, but I want to be clear. It's not because I don't trust you, because I don't love you, because I don't want your input. I am almost embarrassed, despite the wealth, that I have so little control over this. It frustrates me, and this is what it is. And he said this point, and I
Hmm.
remember it was an in-person meeting, and it was kind of this moment. And I looked around, and each of the three kids had tears in their eyes.
Oh,
And the financial advisor, who's a very close personal friend, kind of looked at me, kind of like, hmm. And each of the kids spoke one by one and said, I know how hard that must be for you. I had no idea. And really shared very openly, to their credit, with him that they really felt it was because he didn't trust them, he didn't think
yeah.
they were mature enough. And again, highlighting that in absence of information, people make assumptions. And
No
those
question.
assumptions can be very dangerous.
Yeah, well said. Yeah. When do you find that dads struggle a little more with this kind of vulnerability, self-disclosure, empathic kind of positioning that has to be done? I mean, I certainly do in my practice, and so I'm just curious if it's got to come out in your work too, I would assume. I could be wrong.
Yeah, I always, there was no smiling when you asked the question. I try so hard, it's like there are stereotypes and I'm trying, but yeah,
Mm,
on the whole, I do find, and I think we wrote a paper about this once where it was, we were saying kind of the mom in the family tends to be the chief emotional officer in a
right,
lot of
right.
cases.
Yeah.
That said, I have, and I'm sure you have in your practice, found there are some very, very emotionally aware,
Oh, no
um,
question. Yeah.
high EQ fathers, and especially because families look so differently these days, and there's so many variations. It's not. I'm always pleasantly surprised, I would say. So yes, I do see that as a general trend, but
Uh-huh.
I see it shifting, and I see it shifting with the younger generation. I
Oh,
see it less pronounced there.
for sure. Yeah, for sure with the younger generation. Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, well, blended families, that's got to be, I bet that's some of your most fraught work, isn't it? Because you have competing loyalties, competing feelings about who should get what. And, you know, yeah, can you say more about how you help them navigate that?
Yeah, and I would say from a process perspective, it's not different from a non-blended family. It
Hmm.
just has maybe some additional complexity or additional nuance. And we wrote a,
Right.
a white paper about that topic as well. I think it really just requires even more, as you said, communication,
Yeah.
more explicit communication around um, intention. So, and one
Mhm.
element, a lot of times, especially to your point around gifting or inheritance, I was working with a family that was a blended family, four kids in the family. The eldest was the wife's child from a prior marriage, and then three children together, very, very close. And the eldest was very close. She was essentially raised by her stepdad. She had a
Oh, okay.
relationship, has a relationship with her father, but and they were really grappling. So when they married, the husband and wife, there was not a lot of wealth. They essentially, it's actually a wonderful story. They started a business together and was super, super successful. And they sold it to a private equity company for, I mean, a tremendous, tremendous, hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And when that happened, they really kind of asked this question of, well, these are our children. We can't treat these children differently. And the biggest thing we're trying to avoid, which I sometimes ask families, is we don't want the wealth to create resentment or conflict among the children. Okay, so that
Right.
was
Right.
classified.
For sure. Yeah.
But the kicker was a little bit that the biological father of the eldest daughter had also found very kind of grand amount of financial success in the last, I don't know, 10 years.
Uh,
And he was making some plans for her. So
uh-huh.
it raised this question back to fair versus equal of even the mom brought it up, right? Not the stepdad, of saying, well, I don't know, right? Do we leave it equally, or do we leave her enough where added to what her father, it's equivalent to the other? Because I don't want her to feel slighted, but I certainly don't want her siblings to feel like, wow, she's kind of getting. So it took some conversations. And what I imagine, similar to your line of work, what made it even more challenging is that it's a very kind of contentious still relationship with the ex spouse.
Yeah.
That said, through some communication, right? It's not all kumbaya, but they were able to get some information from him, really framing it. And I coached them a little bit of, this is not about, you know, this is not about trying to get information from you that you feel comfortable. This is about our daughter, and we just want to be thoughtful.
Yeah.
Ultimately, he relented. He shared some of the information, and they adjusted their planning, at least
Mhm.
the gifts that they're leaving upon their death. So everything else, kind
Uh-huh.
of education, to give her an amount, and it actually is literally written in their files, in their kind of legal documents,
Yeah.
that will make them equivalent once you take into account
Oh, that's
the
good.
additional gift.
Yeah. I mean, it all hinges on how healthy and communicative people are, right? I mean, if you have, if the wife's ex-husband had been really pathological and cruel, or if any, if the stepmother really didn't want to give the stepchildren as much. I mean, all these things can be just throw everything into complete disarray, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, the most challenging thing. And I think for most of us, right, there's you know, there's the kind of, what is it, the known unknowns, and then there's
Right.
the unknown unknowns.
Right.
And what they
I,
were
I
really
never thought we'd all
grappling,
be, I never thought we'd all be quoting Donald Rumsfeld, but that's what.
the concept. And
Yeah.
no, but I think it holds.
No, I
And I
agree.
think
Yeah.
even beyond that, and I'm sure you find this is this sense of control that the parents are really grappling with, which is we worked hard. We were so
Right.
comprehensive with our planning. And now we feel like we could potentially make a decision that may upset our children
Right.
because we have no control over this external factor.
Right. Yeah.
And yet, how do you make a decision in spite of that?
Right. Exactly.
That's really kind of the question.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, you must counsel people who don't want, who want to cut a child out of an inheritance. And my counsel for parents is that it's a bad idea. And parents often get mad at me when I say that because, I mean, some of them, quite frankly, have been treated miserably by their adult children. They've been, from their perspective, never abused their child, don't deserve to be estranged, have been cut off from grandchildren they're very close to. And they feel like, why should my kid get a freaking payday at the end of my life that I've worked so hard when I would have gladly given them this money while they're alive? And what I say to them is, well, first of all, you want to think about what your legacy is. It's no matter how you phrase it, it's going to be seen as a rejecting and punitive act on the part of your children. So you can decide to do that, but no matter how you phrase it, that's what it's going to be experienced as. Second of all, for siblings, if you're going to give it to some siblings and not to the other one, that's going to cause problems. The third is that, your kid is doing the best that they can do. They may be estranged from you or treating you terribly because they have mental illness or they've been negatively influenced by who they're married to or they've got bad advice from a therapist or your ex-husband or wife has poisoned them against you. So there's so many reasons why an estrangement can occur and, that that it's not ultimately that the adult child I don't think should be punished for it by the kind of ultimate rejection from the grave. But that's how I think about it as a psychologist, but I'm kind of curious how you think about it on your end.
An interesting question. There's one situation that comes to mind. So generally, just to answer your question directly, when you think about level of complexity, we typically if you think about green, yellow, red, we typically work with green and yellow families. And for red families, we'll connect them with subject matter experts and so forth. So I
Yeah.
haven't seen as many cases, I would say, of just, I'm going to cut somebody out. But
Yeah.
there was one experience that stayed with me. This was about 2 years ago. I was connected through an advisor to a woman in her 50s. Um, she has two brothers. Her father was a very successful real estate investor, and her mother was still living, but was having very, very severe cognitive decline. The brothers, during the father's lifetime, he was a big planner. He had put together a very comprehensive estate plan. From what I understand, was very much kind of equal. The brothers, during his lifetime, had made some very, very poor financial choices, and he had made comments, as she related, during his lifetime to say that this is not a good idea. I need you to be more responsible. And they said, well, it's fine, don't worry about it. And he kind of, I don't want to say threatened, but he really alluded to the fact that, I'm keeping score. Like, this is just, I hate wastefulness.
Yeah.
The reason I share that, the reason I connected with her is her father had had a heart attack, passed. And she found out only after his passing that 2 years before his passing, he had called his trust and estate attorney and significantly shifted his plans, essentially cutting his two sons
Yeah.
out of his inheritance. And it was only because the attorney, from what I understand at the time, said, be thoughtful, at least with your grandchildren, because there was some education. But the reason I share that, it was incredibly heart-wrenching for me, and I spoke with her to give her some advice to hear. And as you can imagine, these brothers were not, pleased to hear the news,
Of course not.
were incredibly angry, not just at their father, but at their sister, to say, you have to make this right. She
Hmm.
actually tried, if you will, to correct it. The
Yeah.
attorney said, no way, because he was
Mm.
in his sound mind.
Right.
So that is the experience that stays with me. And again, the reason I connected with her is to really help her think through that, connected her with a mediator, to really, because she was really struggling and my heart went out to her because she said, look, I did nothing to deserve this. And now I feel
Mm.
like I've lost not only my father, but my
Right.
brothers.
Yeah.
So that is challenging. I would not generally recommend that. You're kind of the expert, you are the expert in estrangement. What I would say though is an offshoot of that I see much more common is really this question again back to fairness versus the client, not cutting out, but how do you think about gifting? Because
Hmm.
this notion of kids obviously could be raised in the same family, often are, and are very
Right.
different and have
What?
different life choices.
Yep.
So one example that comes to mind, this is a family I've been working with probably for about 10 years, three daughters in a family. The middle daughter was getting married. had a beautiful wedding. The parents had very modest wedding of their own, felt very much three daughters. We really want her to have this beautiful, lavish wedding. Everybody loved it. The reason I mention this, the wedding came before, I think, our second annual family meeting. And the eldest daughter, the daughters are incredibly close. She came to me and she said, you seem like the person to ask this. We're so happy. We'll call her Joan. I, I don't know how to ask this because I don't want to come across entitled but we're so happy for our sister. Back of the envelope, my estimate is that this beautiful wedding cost X. I, Valerie, do not want to get married, right? I don't see them. She stayed true. She is not. This was many years ago. But what do you think? Do you think it would be inappropriate for me to potentially ask my parents for that amount or somewhere around that to help purchase an apartment?
Yeah.
Now, my caveat is this was very early in their wealth kind of journey to the extent that they had just kind of had a liquidity event. And I give the parents credit. They approached it with a tremendous amount of openness, curiosity, and I think all of that is based on the fact that they're a very close family and they communicate a lot.
Yeah.
To say, okay, we hadn't thought about that. Sure. And we worked together and I helped them define kind of what are the categories of things and they communicated. But the reason I bring that up, I have now seen at least a dozen, even kind of in the last, I would say, year or 2 years, situations where you can have two different families. In each family, for argument's sake, only one child is getting married. A wedding is being funded. Family A, the other children feel like, okay, the family culture is to support life choices. That's her life choice. We're thrilled to celebrate. Family B, the adult children are saying, are you kidding me? According to my count, that's X dollars.
Oh, yeah.
The distinguishing factor of whether somebody feels that they are being penalized or whether they see it as in the second family first family where everyone is kind of, everything is fine, is how they're viewing it. And the first family, the reason the youngest daughter of the three didn't feel penalized, it is because I will tell you, the youngest daughter has pursued 2 master's degrees and the parents have helped support that.
Yeah.
So their general philosophy as a family is that life is not fair, meaning we cannot, to the dollar, to the cent, do this. What we can do is tell you that we love you equally. And these are the things that we will support. Your life choices, education, things that obviously are not, dangerous, illegal, all of that. But we will do that. And by having those conversations early, before, as the first daughter got married, but before the middle daughter had children, now the youngest got married recently, that really gave them this framework to make decisions. And that's why I always counsel families. The best time to have a process for decision making is before you have a time sensitive, urgent, emotionally charged decision. And if you can do that, it's really going to pay, no pun intended, dividends to you in regards to your family harmony, but also your ability to feel comfortable with your choices.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point. And that siblings generally are tracking these kinds of expenditures on the parts of parents. And so
it's the mental accounting, 100%. I always joke, but I have I have relatively young children, and I always say neither my daughter or my son like to eat cereal. My 5-year-old son always notices when I put a slightly more in the cereal in his sister's bowl when I'm rushing in the morning, right? Completely unintentional, but that he clocks that.
A question that I get from parents as well. I want to will my children something, or I even want to help them, my adult child buy a house, but I hate who they're marrying, and I don't want them to be able to share in any of the assets. And so that decision can happen both around, say, a big down payment or purchasing a house or inheritance. And, I don't know if there's any way to really, I mean, it's hard because I've worked with 2 different families, one where the adult child was kind of okay with that conversation, another one where it sort of blew up. The family that the parents wanted to help their adult child with a house, but they wanted it to be signed that if the couple ever split up, that all that money would go to their adult child and that their spouse wouldn't get any of it or something like that. So this kind of conversations can be particularly fraught, particularly if there's already a certain degree of conflict or distance in the parent-adult-child relationships. And do you face that much? And if so, do you have particular guidance around it?
partners is definitely adds another dynamic. Interestingly, our next white paper that we're just in the process of finalizing is called
I'm
Navigating the
gonna I'm
Scale of
gonna put all your papers up on my website so people can read
That
them.
one is not, no, happy to share. That one's not ready yet, but you're right.
Okay.
I say that to just,
Yeah.
attest. It is a topic. I think the well structuring is very kind of situation specific. Someone needs to speak to their estate counsel and so forth. But I would say,
Yeah.
generally speaking, there are different ways to do this, right? There's
Yeah.
certainly, absent giving somebody directly funds to purchase something. I've
Yeah.
seen situations where trusts own property. I was actually just with a family where it's not that the parents love the in-laws, actually. There's no
Mm,
animosity,
that's
but
good.
given the scale of the wealth, they're very concerned about that, and just given the size, the value of that particular property and where it is.
Hmm.
So they have the trust own it, which, the trust owns it.
Oh, I see.
And they live there. There are other situations where sometimes, they will provide, I mean, the obvious, not the total value. Sometimes where the parents will provide an intra-family loan, which basically means it's providing a loan generally, at the federal um, set rate, which is adjusted for inflation, but generally speaking, it tends to be lower than if somebody went to a bank. So there are
Yeah.
different options for it. What I've seen though, and I don't know if this is what you were highlighting, people have different appetites for this, right? The family that
Right.
I was just with, the young adult child has no problem with the trust owning the property. His wife is thrilled. I mean, it's a huge blessing, and it's I have another family that I worked with where the daughter, this tends to come up, there is some gender kind of, I see this. Um, it's her family that has the wealth, and her
Mm,
husband and her, I would say, felt very uncomfortable with a trust owning a home that they were going to make their home.
yeah.
And they, communicated that. And I helped coach them through that. But ultimately, it wasn't about convincing the parents. I mean, they did not, they have received gifts in other ways. They receive annual exclusion gifts, but in that case, they made a very intentional decision to purchase a different home, but they
Mm,
owned it together, and that was their prerogative. And I think the fact that they were able to handle that, which can be a kind of an awkward situation, again,
yeah.
is testament to this particular family that had family meetings before this daughter ever got engaged.
Yeah. Yeah, it highlights your point that the earlier and sooner you can have these conversations, and probably to a certain extent, the more you can do it, the more you're kind of anticipating the potential pitfalls that may inevitably come later on down the line. Yeah, how does wealth affect people's identity, would you say, in both in positive and negative ways?
That's an interesting question. Kind of, I've definitely seen, just because of the data points in the different families, I've
Yeah,
definitely seen it where it affects identity in the sense, all the things that I think all the people wish, if they are in a, financially abundant position where the young adult or whoever the family member is, and by the way, it's not always the kids, it's
sure.
um, but
Right.
it really empowers them. It empowers them. I can think of several families where the rising generation family member, in one case, pursued a very meaningful career that's not high paying, but kind of became a social worker and created other things. In another
Hmm.
family, somebody used it to start to really help support a particular cause. So they really feel empowered by it. I've
Hmm.
also seen the situations where somebody is so overwhelmed with guilt
Yeah, I was going to ask you about
that
that.
it challenges them. And there's one particular situation. There's a family. This was shortly after COVID, so I think there's a little bit of just kind of general uncertainty in the world. This was a young person in a family, young man. I think it was one of those factors I imagine you see a lot in your work, but it's a combination of factors. COVID, there was uncertainty. This young man grew up in a very nice, fairly homogenous neighborhood, had was just about leaving for college. And then because of COVID, it was like taking classes, online.
Mm.
The reason I bring this up, the reason the parents reached out and I worked with them and their advisor, is they were finding some very dangerous behaviors on the part of the son and the
Hmm.
mom. And these parents, I give them so much credit. They were so thoughtful and so kind of open minded. I think it's the best adjective. But the mom really got very emotional and said, I never in my wildest dreams did I think, also first generation wealth creators, did I ever think this would affect him this way? But
Hmm.
he really was struggling with, there's so much inequality in the world.
Yeah.
I don't deserve this. What have I done? So a lot of what I worked on with them is one, communication. And I know some people would say, well, Valerie, if somebody's feeling that way, do you really think sharing information about how much there is really kind of the answer? I think in a progressive way, meaning kind of, the dimmer switch, it is.
Over
And it
time. Yeah.
was for him because it gave him more clarity of, first of all, it's not like this is coming to you outright. There are structures. These are the ground rules. And to our earlier point, you have some agency, not today, maybe, but over time, for example, you can become a co-trustee. He started to kind of understand that he had some agency to do good, to pursue things he was passionate in. I think that's
Hmm.
one. And
Yeah.
it really just also the skill building of which we haven't hit upon yet. But I do think I find that sometimes there's this assumption that if somebody sells a business or a successful CEO, what have you, that automatically they have skills to manage
Right.
it. And just because
Yeah.
somebody can build a business doesn't mean they are effective at investing or governance
Right.
or
Of course. Yeah.
philanthropy. And I think there's so much jargon. I've worked, you might find this interesting, I've worked with a few, pardon me, Powerball lottery winners over the years. And I will never
Interesting.
forget, there was one individual who had won the lottery. He was working with a wonderful advisor. And he had come, though, to meet with some specialists, kind of different areas, investing, so forth. And I remember I was kind of in the middle of his day. And I came, this was in New York, to meet with him. And it was a full day. He seemed kind of tired and there was a break. And I just sat down and I asked a really open ended question, something like, how's it going? Right? Something, because you could tell it was very full. And I said something, in my experience with especially kind of sudden wealth, it tends to be an overwhelm, but also there's so much jargon. And I said it candidly, Josh, to kind of test out. I wanted to see if he would respond. And he
Yeah.
looked at me, and I will never forget this. And he said, Valerie, I have been here for 5 hours. And I'm writing down, he showed me his notebook, all of the terms that have been used. I have no idea, and it was like, LIBOR, kind of. And he's like,
Right.
I don't know. I feel so
Yeah.
overwhelmed. But he was sitting there.
Sure.
So we had
Yeah.
this really great conversation around um, taking a step back, what is important to him, and really kind of taking those terms, that jargon, and really demystifying.
Sure.
And again, he is an adult, he was an adult, but I think this idea is that guilt and the sense of identity could affect not just the rising generation. And I ended up working with him and his family. And what I'm most
Mm.
proud to say is that he and his family not only have navigated wealth effectively, but they have done tremendous things for their extended family, but also philanthropically, which
Oh,
I think
wow.
is the best example to say this is somebody who is really empowered by the wealth. The
Yeah.
wealth is not driving them.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good place to potentially end on. But before we end, Valerie, is there anything that we didn't cover that you think is really would be good for my listeners to hear or understand, or you want to emphasize, or?
No, I've really enjoyed this. Thank you for thoughtful questions. I think the last thing I would emphasize, and this is something that I've learned, is when I present to clients, there's so many great quotes out there. One of my favorite quotes is a Thomas Edison quote, and the quote is, vision without execution is hallucination. The reason I share that is all of us, everyone listening, each of us, right, is so busy day to day. We're making so many decisions.
Yeah.
You feel overwhelmed. What I would say when it comes to decision making, governance, however you define it,
Yeah.
family communication, the most important thing to remember, and that I've candidly learned, that I humbly share with you and your listeners, is that the process is part of the product. And what
Hmm.
I mean by that,
I
somebody,
totally.
if you're a parent, you don't have to have all the answers. If you're a rising generation family member, by the way, and we connect with so many of them who attend our programs, who will come up to me sometimes after, my teammates, and say, this is great. Like, how do I start the dialogue? It Taking a first step is important. And if it means you don't have a clear understanding of your financial planning or your stuff when you need to start,
Hmm.
have that plan, right? Speak with your financial advisor. If it
Right.
is about communicating with your children, just you don't have to have all of the answers, but taking the time first and foremost to think about what success means to you
Yeah.
is incredibly important.
I think that makes 100% sense. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to meet you and to talk to you. And yeah, hopefully there's so much more we could talk about, but this is probably good for one day. So thanks so
Thank you
much for
so
coming on
much.
my podcast, Valerie. And if you found this helpful, please follow the podcast and leave a review. It helps other people find the show who could benefit from it. If you want to learn more about my work, you can visit me at www.drjoshuacoleman.com. That is drjoshuacoleman.com, or subscribe to my Substack, Family Troubles. Hope to see you in one of those places soon. Take care.